Um, Again, I like to spend time on these topics because we can all grapple as artists with the lines between, and when artists blur the lines between these things, and when things become sexualized, and when if something becomes too sexualized or something somehow moves into a realm where it can become possibly censored. Yeah, so I like to look at what those things are. And again, just to go back, because I don't think I quite said it in the last little lecture, is that in the 60s and 70s, we had generations of freedom, and we had what was known as the sexual revolution, where people wanted to move out of the traditional ways that the sexes were viewed. And in the 80s, particularly with photography, there's been a blurring of the lines, and also in terms of marketing um, for various products. Some of the marketing firms have really pushed the boundaries of, of images and moved them more sexualized to sell a product. And that's changed the way we've looked at the world, and we've looked at the images in advertising. And it's surprising because we've accepted many of the changes. If we looked at, I'll show you some images, and how it's changed. So marketing has really, and advertising have changed the way that we've thought of the world, and they've perhaps even allowed the world to evolve and move forward. But one of the big things that happened is sex was used to sell a product. And people realized that sexuality was a kind of way of getting people's attention, and getting the focus on a product. Um, Let me show you this image. This was an advertisement in the 80s that went up in Times Square, and it was for Calvin Klein underwear. Now, this caused quite a sensation because here you had an entire billboard up the side of a building of this man in his little tidy whities. And we weren't used to seeing men in this kind of sexualized way. And this really caused some attention. So Calvin Klein, also during the 80s, here we had Brooke Shields, who was a teenage model, teenage actress. And she was even on TV saying things like, "Nothing gets between me and my Calvin Klein jeans," which was actually a kind of sexualized comment that garnered attention because of her age and because it was pushing the boundaries. Calvin Klein has always tended to do that. Here we even see another image for Calvin Klein jeans, where we have two male models here embracing. And this is even creating a different way of looking at same-sex relationships. So you can see how advertisement has pushed the boundaries. Um, and we even have things like this obsession ad with two people here on this naked on this swing. Yeah, so the sexuality garners the attention, and it sells the product of there. Now, in the dance world, um, we too have images that with people wearing less clothes, perhaps the clothes are also diaphanous, and we can see through them. And in the visual art world, we even started this course looking at this Botticelli's Venus. Um, and again, here's an unclothed figure on this half shell rising out of the waves. So we see that nudity and sensuality have been a part of art. It's probably since the very beginning of art. And there were some even very early fertility images that we were looking at sculptures, early sculpture that was celebrating the human form and the fertility of the human form. Now, what's interesting that we'll look at in this idea of why we do it in dance is sometimes the nakedness is not about just being naked. It is also a metaphor for things like vulnerability, for things like just seeing and celebrating the human being and the human form, and the vulnerableness of a human form. And rather than that, then looking at the human as an object. And that is something we kind of covered in the last topic. But there's a difference between nudity and pornography. And that I don't know that I'll end up giving you a complete answer to it. I'll give you some definitions here, but the biggest thing is that you grapple with the question of when things become sexualized, and when we bring sexuality into the picture, when does sexuality then cross a line, and when does nudity somehow becomes something else and something different. I also think that performing artists will also always deal with this, because as a performer, oftentimes we're asked to do dances with less clothing on and things that are perhaps more nude. And so we have to think about when, how we feel about our own bodies being exposed in that way. So this becomes something to it's something to think about and something to just sort of grapple with. Also, as a choreographer, if you're designing things for people and you're wanting to move in these types of avenues. Yeah. Now, pornography is printed or visual materials. Oftentimes it's depicting the sexual organs or the sexual act, yeah? And it's designed to stimulate erotic rather than aesthetic or emotional feeling, yeah? Now, what I like about this definition is that this idea that it's designed to stimulate erotic rather than aesthetic, that there's a difference between those things. The other thing I often say, which I've said before, is there's a difference when we look at the performer as an object and when we look at the performer as a subject. Those are two very different things. So oftentimes when something is sexualized and starts to move towards being gratuitous and then shifting towards where some people might consider it pornographic, usually what can happen is that the person sort of becomes objectified, and then we're just looking at them as a way to stimulate the viewer, in this erotic way. And just finally, if we think about how the world has changed, we have had images of sexuality and sensuality since the dawn and the beginning of art. So that has existed, and probably the big change seems to happen when we get photography. That photography has really allowed us to encounter far more images. And there's something about a photographed image that we sometimes think is much more realistic, if we talk about realism, than a Greek face is, although both are depicting the human form, and sometimes the human form and sensuality and sexuality. I want to touch base just a little on censorship, because censorship becomes another topic of when is something disallowed disallowed. And we went over a kind of definition of censorship, And I wanted to just give a couple examples of some famous shows. Censorship sort of came into the public eye a lot in 1989 because, particularly in the art world, we had a show of Robert Mapplethorpe's photographs in Cincinnati. And the show had traveled to a couple different cities and then it got to Cincinnati. And when it was in Cincinnati, this third city, um, the police raided the exhibit and took several of the photographs and took them out of the show. And what was fascinating about this is it went to court. It blew up. It garnered a lot of attention in the art world. Many people didn't know the show existed until this happened. But it became a thing. If you know Robert Mapplethorpe's photos, these are some photos of Robert Mapplethorpe. These are not, you'll have to Google the photos that were removed from the show. He had some highly sexualized photos, and Robert Mapplethorpe was a gay man, so he also really depicted images of sexual acts between men, and those really caused the kind of uproar about the show and eventually the taking of the seizing. When the photos were taken from the show, the museum, the Cincinnati Museum of Art, went to court about it. They brought in lots of experts. The experts talked about how each of these photographs were works of art. They described the lighting, the photography, the technique of the works, and eventually the show, the photos were given back, and the show continued in its original way. So many cried that it was a kind of censorship. And here's another image that came up. And you can, if I asked you, some people know this image. This is Serrano's. It's typically known as the Piss Christ. And what he did was he took this little plastic Jesus and he submerged it in a vial of his urine and he photographed it. So it had all these amber colors and these glows, but the treatment of the image and how he got the image, there was a kind of uproar with many people. And what you saw is that in the world and during that time in the 90s, 89, 90, you got a lot of Congress really upset that US taxpayer dollars were being used to fund works of art like this. The big question that comes up with this kind of censorship is who's supposed to decide it, and how do we decide, and what panel decides it? And you'll even see that there are different tolerances amongst people, and then there are kinds of, I think, group tolerances as well. One more image. This also happened in that same era of the early 90s, late 80s. And this is Chris Olifer's, one of this Black Madonna. And Rudy Giuliani had great issues with this being in a show at the Brooklyn Museum because on the Black Madonna here, there's some representations there of kinds of genitalia, but also there's elephant dung that was used. He's an African artist, and he claimed that this was part of his tradition, part of his world, and part of his art process. Giuliani threatened the museum. It went to court, and eventually the museum won the case, and this was continued to happen. Yeah. So the biggest thing with all of this sensuality and sexuality is that sex does become a kind of complicated issue, and it's an issue that we'll deal with in the world of art, and particularly dance artists will deal with it with costuming, and sometimes we'll even deal with it with types of movement. When does movement become sexualized? Also, what age should we ask a, a dancer? At what age can they express their sensuality, their sexuality? That becomes another topic that is used. And where are the lines that happen with all of this also? And then there's also the image. This also is, if we have it, how do we let an audience know, without putting major warnings out about something as beautiful and wonderful as the human body? So that sometimes I will take offense even when someone says warning nudity. It's like, well, there's nothing wrong with nudity. It's we all come into this world nude and naked. So there's nothing wrong with that. But how do we express sexuality in the world, and how does sexuality come into our art world, and how do we responsibly deal with it as a subject? That's the big topic to look at with this. Okay.